Hi everyone, today we're going to take a look at an unusual lens from 7Artisans. It's their 50mm f1.4 tilt shift lens. So if you're not familiar with tilt shift lenses, basically they are technical lenses designed to help with perspective distortions and controlling the depth of field via changing the plane of focus, hitting the sensor. So the lens accomplishes this through two different movements. You can tilt the lens up and down, or really any direction, because the lens can be rotated a full 360 degrees. And the second movement is through shifting. So it actually moves the lens parallel with the camera's image sensor, thereby effectively widening your field of view. So as you can see, the mechanics of the lens is relatively simple and the application is really not that much more difficult. Now, full disclosure, 7Artisans did send this lens out to me to review, but as always, I'll give you my honest and fair opinion. Now, the lens is going to be available for the Sony E mount, and it is compatible with full frame and APS-C, and it's also going to come in the Fuji X mount, which is a version that I have, and then also for micro four thirds. So let's go over the build quality of this lens, and like every lens I've gotten from 7Artisans, it feels very premium, has a nice all metal construction including the lens mount. The focusing ring is very well dampened, and the also has an aperture ring which is clickless, but it is also very well dampened. Now I should also note, like all tilt shift lenses, this is fully manual focus. It also comes with this atypical screw-on metal front lens cap along with a plastic rear lens cap. Now this lens retails for just $229, and in the tilt shift lens world that is extremely affordable because typically a tilt shift lens is going to run you, $1,000, $2,000, as high as $3,000 for some of the newer ones that I've seen. Alright, so let's talk about the optical design of this lens and then we'll get into the performance. So basically we have 7 elements in 6 groups, so it's a relatively simple optical design, and we have a nice bright aperture from f1.4 to f16, as well as 12 aperture blades or diaphragm blades with a minimum focusing distance of 0.5 meters or half a meter. Alright, now I'm going to test this lens on my Fujifilm X-H2, which is a 40 megapixel APS-C camera. And looking at the lens wide open at f1.4, you can see that it's actually very soft, and there is some detail there, but the contrast is low and it's not very sharp. And then going into the corners, the sharpness is actually pretty consistent with the center, although it did fall off slightly, and there's virtually no vignetting, at least on my APS-C camera. Going down to f2 and f2.8, things improve slightly, but it's still not great. Even at f4, it's not really until you get to f5.6 that you have good sharpness and contrast corner to corner. f8 looks good, f11 looks good, although we've lost some contrast, and then by f16 it's pretty soft again like we were at 1.4. Now chromatic aberrations like purple and green fringing are pretty bad up until about f4 where it's under control, but if you tilt the lens in any direction then all bets are off, as to be expected. Now ghosting and flaring is pretty well controlled depending on how you angle the lens into the sun. You will get some flaring, but for the most part there's still pretty good contrast and very little ghosting. So overall I'd say the optical performance of this lens is just fair. You really have to stop down to like f5.6 or f8 to get the best sharpness and contrast with the least amount of like chromatic aberrations and ghosting and flaring and all of that. But that's okay, because that's not what this lens is about. This lens is about the tilt shift capabilities, so let's explore that next. So let's start with the tilt feature. The idea here is we're basically shifting the focal plane of the lens so it's no longer parallel with the sensor in the camera, and this has a couple of different effects on the image. So here's an image tilted at 0 degrees, meaning the lens focal plane is still parallel with the sensor, and then here's an image where I tilted the lens vertically by 7 degrees so that now the top and the bottom of the image are blurred, but the center still remains in focus. Now if I rotate the lens 90 degrees, I can now tilt the lens left to right. So here's a normal image tilted at 0 degrees, and then this image here is tilted horizontally the full 7 degrees. And I really had a lot of fun tilting the lens, shifting the plane of focus so I can isolate subjects like this row of people laying on the benches, or the reflection of this person walking across by the puddle. And you don't have to tilt the lens just horizontally or vertically, you can also tilt it at different angles like in these shots here. Now there's some other practical applications for the tilt feature, like in product or food photography, where you want everything in focus on the top of a table from front to back without having to resort to, say, focus stacking, and where even using a very high aperture number like f22 will not get everything in focus. Now you may have noticed that some of the images have a miniaturization effect or a model train effect, where things look really tiny in the frame, and you can exaggerate this by taking a wider field of view, like in these shots here. Alright, now let's talk about the shift feature, where we actually keep the focal plane of the lens parallel with the sensor, but effectively what we're doing is expanding our field of view. And this is really useful if you want to do seamless panoramics, for example. Now, another common use of the shift feature is in architectural photography, where we're trying to eliminate converging lines. And converging lines happen when the sensor plane is not parallel with the subject. So for example, if you're taking a picture of a flat building and you want to get the entire building in the frame, you may have to point the camera up to get everything in the frame. But when you do that, that's when you get these converging lines at the top. So rather than point the camera up, you can keep your camera level so that the sensor plane is parallel with the front of the building, and then simply rotate the lens so that you can shift in a vertical motion like this. And then you should be able to get the entire building within the frame, and then you won't have these converging lines because the sensor is still parallel with the front of the building. Now, I know that last image isn't a great example because this is a 50mm lens, so it's not ideal for architectural photography. Typically, you would use a much wider lens, say like a 10 or 14mm, not a 50mm. So the shift feature on this lens, I would say, is more useful for doing that panorama than it is for architectural photography. Now, there's a few other compromises to this lens other than the focal length, which is purely a physical limitation. Now, we've already talked about one, which is the raw optical quality of the lens, which I kind of rated as just fair because, you know, it's a little soft wide open and it doesn't really sharpen up until you get to f/5.6. But the other one has to do with the tilt shift feature itself. There were definitely some compromises made here as well, and it's easier just to show you what I mean. So to use the tilt function, there's two knobs here. One is for adjusting the tilt angle, and then the other one is for locking it into that angle position. So to start the tilt function, you loosen here, the locking nut here, and then you use this knob here to rotate to the angle you want. But the problem is that the lens is just loose here. It's not dampened at all. Every other tilt lens I've used, this action here is very well dampened so that when I rotate this knob, the lens will stay in that position when I let go. But on this lens, if I let go, it just kind of drops, due to gravity. So this then becomes always a two-handed operation, which if you're on a tripod, it's not a big deal. You can kind of have your two fingers here in the front, adjust it to the angle that you want, and then tighten it down. But if you're out in the field, just kind of hand holding, this is very, very awkward, as you can see. The other problem is with the shift function. Most shift lenses I've used, if not all of them, don't use like this locking tab here. What they do is they also have a knob for adjusting the shift function. And the problem with this locking knob is that it has notches in it so that when you lock it into position, it's spring loaded. Sometimes it gets stuck. If the lens isn't perfectly angled into the notch, like right now it's stuck, so I have to kind of wiggle the lens a little bit to unlock it, and then it comes loose. Now, I don't think anything's going to break unless you really try and force the motion when this kind of jams up. So just use a little finesse and care and you'll be fine. And then the last thing I want to mention is actually has to do with rotating the lens. Now, when I rotate the lens to 0 degrees, it's not exactly level or horizontal and parallel with the camera. It's just a few degrees off. So what that means is when I'm shifting left to right to do my panos, the images are going to be just slightly off. Now, it's not a big deal and you'll still get perfectly stitched panos in software, but I just thought I'd mention it. This lens retails for $226 and there's always sales and coupons going on, so definitely check out the links below if you're interested in this lens. Now, with that said, a tilt shift lens is just not for everyone. In fact, I don't even own a tilt shift lens myself because a lot of the images I showed you today that I took with this lens can be done in photo editing software, particularly like the miniaturization effect and the perspective corrections. Now, some valid arguments can be made to use a tilt shift lens, say, versus doing it in post-processing. The most common one I hear has to do with, you retain the full resolution with a tilt shift lens versus when you go into software, a lot of times you have to chop out pixels to do the perspective corrections. But I think a more convincing reason for a tilt shift lens has to do with the creative workflow. If you're the kind of person that likes to do things in camera while you're out in the field and you can see things with your own eyes and what the effect is going to be when you're doing the tilt and shift, this makes a lot more sense for you, because coming home with 1,000 images and then trying to sort through those and figure out which ones will look good with a tilt shift effect after the fact and you're back home is a lot harder than just experimenting out in the field, and it's certainly not as much fun. But that's a decision only you can make, so I hope you enjoyed this review. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.